Welcome everyone to my presentation. I will be talking about Nix, and I'll explain what I mean by Nix clearly later in the slides. My name is Spencer Heywood. I work for MIT Lincoln Laboratory. I participate in security research for the federal government. And as stated in the slide, no laboratory funding or resources were used to produce the findings or results in this presentation. So if you want to look at the source code for this presentation, the HTML file, Markdown, I have a lot of links in this presentation. So I would recommend checking out the GitHub repository, which has everything related to my slides in it. I may add things later in the future, but feel free to go to that repository if you need more information. So my journey with Nix so far is closely tied to macOS because back in 2018, I was working at the Utah Education Network. I had an Intel MacBook and I used Linux a lot. And as a result, I also used Homebrew. Homebrew is great. I really enjoy it. But for whatever reason, I was looking for something a bit faster. And I was just looking to see if there were any alternatives for macOS for command line package managers. And I discovered Nix, which was great. And funnily enough, being a huge Linux user, I was pleasantly surprised when I found out that NixOS existed, which is a Linux distribution based around the Nix package manager and functional programming language. So I was very, very happy to find not only a package manager for my Mac at work, but also something I could use more in my home lab, in my professional life, and so on. And I am also a recent Nix packages contributor. I am officially a part of the Darwin maintainers list. So I've contributed some macOS packages, some Linux packages. So I know a little bit about Nix, not a lot though. So what is Nix? So Nix can mean a few things, and all of these things can be referred to as Nix, but I will clearly define what I mean when I refer to Nix-related things. So when I say Nix, I mean the package manager and or programming language. When I say NixOS, I mean the Linux distribution. When I say Nix Darwin, I mean the NixOS-like macOS management tool. And Nix packages is the repository where every Nix package is defined. So these are the things that I'll be referring to throughout my presentation, and just so we all have a common vernacular to go off of. So if you want to install Nix, you can do so on macOS or Linux. And it's not restricted to specific distributions. You can install Nix on basically any Linux distribution and obviously macOS. And these are the official commands for installing Nix. I actually prefer the Determinate Systems Nix installer. I think it has better defaults. It's still using the base Nix package, but it just has some defaults and a better user experience that I prefer. So if you want to use the Determinate Systems Nix installer, this is the command for that. You can also just Google Determinate Systems Nix installer. And obligatory warning that was on the previous slide, don't run installers without inspecting them initially. It's really important that you inspect installers, make sure they aren't doing anything malicious, make sure you're not getting man in the middle, and so on. So I use a feature in Nix called flakes. And the official definition for flakes are the unit for packaging Nix code in a reproducible and discoverable way. In a podcast I enjoy, they made an analogy to Nix flakes being almost like Lego pieces, where you can grab a thing from somewhere on the internet, reuse it, and just kind of stack on top of each other. And so I really like flakes. And I believe that in a recent survey, the Nix community they analyzed the usage of Flakes, and about half of Nix users are using Flakes and half aren't. So if you aren't using Flakes, you can still get a lot of the same benefits, but the commands I'm using in my presentation might be a bit different. So just be aware of that. If you want to run the commands that I have in this to turn on Flakes, you see the configuration parameter there. You have to enable it. If you use the determinate systems Nix installer, Flakes are enabled by default. But I really like Flakes. I think they're a great way to package code and move it around. And that's essentially what Nix does. It grabs a thing, moves it somewhere else for you. If you want to try out Nix and you have a Docker running on your machine, I have a Nix container on Docker Hub. Feel free to run this, and it will give you an interactive shell that you can play around with Nix, and then when you exit, it'll be gone. So if you want to try it, please try out my Docker container. So here's some basic usage of Nix itself. So first, you can obviously use it as a package manager. So like any other package manager on Linux, you can, or macOS, you can just install a package. For Flakes, you have something called a profile where everything related to your user is contained. So in the Flake usage, you do Nix profile, install, and then the thing you're trying to install. In regard to the format of this, you see how I have Nix packages, #curl. Nix packages is a Flake. That's the official Nix packages repository, usually available by default on any system with Nix installed. So theoretically, if you're using Flakes, this command should just work. What's great about Nix, though, is that you could change this URL to any repository on GitHub, GitLab. There's lots of different ways that you can consume things with Nix, which is really great how flexible it is. If you want to search for a package, there's Nix search, the Flake you're searching, which is Nix packages in this case, and the package name. So Nix search, Nix packages, curl. Then finally, you can actually run packages with Nix without installing them to your system permanently. So you can see here at the bottom, I run which hello. I don't have hello on my machine. But if I do Nix run Nix packages #hello, Nix will pull down Nix packages, grab the hello package, throw it in my Nix store temporarily, and allow me to execute the package. Then when that command finishes, if I run which hello again, it's still not there. It's not persistently installed. One thing that is a gotcha that I think is important to know is that if you use Nix, by default, garbage collection doesn't happen. So when you run a thing or you pull down something from Nix, it will stay on your system unless you collect garbage. And that's the command that I prefer. Nix collect garbage, delete old. You can also specify a time period, but just make sure if you're playing around with Nix that you run that every once in a while, just so you clean up stuff that's on your system. One note on that, if you use the determinate systems recently made a new change to their package, so they now have their own flavor of Nix. And as far as I understand, Nix collect garbage happens on a regular basis by default. I haven't tried it, so I can't verify that for sure, but just something to be aware of. Then finally, if you want to have a temporary shell development environment with a couple of packages, you can run the Nix shell command to provide multiple things. So you could be like, in this case, I'm getting the nmap package and the mass scan package. So after that command runs, when I run which nmap, it's now available to my shell. And then when I type in exit, it disappears, which is great. A perfect example of when this has been useful, a lot of the challenges for Hackers Challenge have or require tools that I don't normally want installed. And so on my system with Nix, I can just temporarily grab those packages, do the thing for the Hackers Challenge, and then exit, and boom, everything's gone. I don't keep a bunch of stuff around. So I think that's a great use case for Nix, even if it's just temporary. So in the last slide, you probably saw that crazy path for nmap, and I have it here again. So we look here, which nmap, You see Nix store, some crazy hash, the package name, the version, and then bin nmap. So Nix is fully reproducible. And what that means is that if package A requires package B, both of those packages will be pulled down and they will be available to each package. And so when you install something with Nix and it's packaged well, theoretically, it includes absolutely everything it needs for that thing to run. So now let's go into the functional programming language. And it might seem a bit odd for a package manager to also be a functional programming language, but I think it's really powerful. If you want to learn Nix, the functional programming language, I would recommend a couple of things. So first, learn how to use the Nix REPL command. And I'm still not very good at this, but it's really helpful to be able to practice what you're trying to configure in a live environment. And understanding what's going on in the REPL really leads to a lot of solidified understanding of how this tool is actually working. Another example or another recommendation on my end would be to look at examples of things you're trying to accomplish. That's probably been the biggest thing for me, especially when I first started getting into NixOS, the Linux distribution. It was really helpful to look at other people's code, copy it, see if I could get it working. One caveat with that is if you use a bunch of other people's code and you don't know what you're doing, when things break, it's really painful. So going back to the initial recommendation, I would highly recommend if you want to be proficient in Nix, learn the functional programming language. I didn't start learning the functional programming language until about 2 years ago, and I feel like it would have greatly benefited me to learn sooner. So that's something I would recommend. I would also recommend that in your text editor, be it VS Code, Vim, Helix, whatever, implement Nix language awareness. That really saves a lot of time. If you have a syntax error, that instead of trying to rebuild your thing and waiting for Nix to fail, you can just look in your editor for any errors that you might be introducing already. And I think that this has probably been one of the biggest time savers for me. Then finally, if you run into roadblocks, ask people who use Nix who are more experienced than you if they can give you help. The Nix community is relatively friendly. I've never had issues just reaching out to strangers and being like, hey, you're doing a thing. How are you doing this? How does this work? People are very friendly and welcoming. So going back to Flakes, there's a couple of key words that you should know about with Flakes. So in Flakes, there are inputs and outputs. So inputs are everything inside or anything outside of your Flake that you're bringing in. So for example, if you're using packages from Nix packages would be an input, as you can see here. And you can specify different branches. You can specify, if I have a special fork of Nix packages that I want to use instead of Nix packages, Nix Flakes give you the flexibility to do all of that. And you can also see here in this example, I have a second input. So I have a first input, Nix packages.url, but then the second input, which is some file, is just a URL. And you see I have the Flake equals false parameter. So you can reuse things on the internet that are not Nix Flakes and don't have any awareness about Nix Flakes, which is really nice because now you can use Nix to cart around things that are other Flakes, but also that may not be. So like I said earlier, there are also outputs, and outputs are things in your Flake that you're trying to create. For example, in this case, I am creating an x86 64 Linux output named some shell environment, which is a dev shell, and it provides the mass_scan and nmap package. And so theoretically, you could build some nice integrations to where if you cd into the folder containing your Flake, it automatically sets up this shell environment. I think that Flakes and Nix are a really great tool if you want a per project thing that will provide your shell environment or your developer environment with tools. So here's a complete example. I won't go through every single thing, but you can see I have my inputs defined, and then later I have my outputs defined. And again, in the example, I'm just creating a dev shell with some packages for me. Very useful if you want to create a developer environment, a security environment, whatever. And you can see at the bottom, if you want to use this flake.nix file, you would just cd into the same directory, and you would run nixdevelop.hash. And the .hash, dot is the current directory, hash is the thing you're trying to build. And in this case, since I have a default shell, it'll know. But if I had multiple outputs defined, I would change it to nixdevelop.hash, and then the name of the output I was trying to develop with. So before I continue, one other caveat with Nix that I would strongly recommend you get familiar with. Nix, in order to move things around, uses Git heavily. So if you're using a Nix flake, if you're developing something with a Nix flake, ensure that your repository, ensure that the tool you're using has Git awareness implemented and that you understand how to use Git. That's kind of a core fundamental thing to using Nix flakes, is that it relies heavily on Git for the ability to move things around. So in the previous example, it was an x86 64 Linux exclusive package. But most packages in Nix are available for Intel, ARM, Linux, and Intel and Apple Silicon macOS. If you're not sure about a package, you can go to search.nixos.org, pull up the package you're looking for, and then if you hit more details, it'll show you, hey, this thing is available for Linux, macOS, whatever. And if you're developing flakes and you want to make cross-platform flakes, there are some tools like Flake Parts and Flake Utils. I use Flake Utils in order to more easily create cross-platform flakes. And for me, since I am often in a Linux or macOS environment, it's very helpful to have a Nix flake that is cross-platform that will work on any system that I am on. So let's talk about NixOS. NixOS is a Linux distribution that actually uses Nix to actualize its configuration. So instead of, if you're on a traditional Linux distribution such as Ubuntu, Fedora, CentOS, RHEL, whatever, usually on those systems, if you want to install a thing, you DNF or apt install thing, and then you manually configure the configuration file, and then you make sure the services are started and enabled. With Nix, or with NixOS, you define everything that you want to actually happen on your system. And then when you rebuild with NixOS Rebuild, Nix will make the thing happen. So in this case, I am defining I want a Minecraft server service enabled, and I have a couple of parameters set. So if I were to throw this in my configuration file and I run NixOS Rebuild switch, the thing eventually is realized after the build successfully completes. If you want to know what options are available, I would recommend going to this URL, search.nixos.org/options. Very helpful if you're a NixOS administrator and you want to look for a thing, for example, I want to know how to spin up Minecraft or Redis or whatever. Just search for that thing in the NixOS options. Makes life a lot easier. On top of that, if you're on a running NixOS system, you can just do man configuration.nix on a live NixOS system to see all options. So I have a couple of pros versus cons. I won't go too deep into it. Ultimately, I don't think that NixOS is a great fit in every single environment. And here are some of the pros. I think that NixOS is the only Linux distribution I'm aware of that allows you to selectively choose between being on the bleeding edge versus being unstable. For example, if I want to be on the latest kernel, I can be. But if I want to run the stable version of Nextcloud or Apache, whatever it is, NixOS with Nix gives you the flexibility to switch between bleeding edge and unstable, which I really love. So in my home lab, all of my systems are running on unstable, with the exception of specific packages that I want to be slower. And I really like the flexibility that it gives. Additionally, codified immutable systems are usually more secure and also more auditable. Some downsides though. NixOS system configurations don't translate to other Linux distributions. So if you get really into NixOS, you're not going to be able to, just grab a NixOS configuration, throw it onto a Red Hat server, and it work. It's just not going to work. Many tools don't know how to handle the Nix store and or immutable file systems. And that's especially true with security tools. Security tools often barely know how to work with Linux, let alone barely know how to work with an immutable file system that is so weird. And then finally, I think one other big caveat is that because everything is reproducible, it can be bad for disk space. So for example, if I have package A that relies on package B, if I have package C that also relies on a different version of package B, I might have multiple versions of package B running on my system. And that can be pretty bad for disk space. So if you are going to use Nix/NixOS, just be aware that if you don't collect garbage regularly and or you are duplicating dependencies, it can be pretty heavy on your disk. So some other cool Nix implementations. There's Nix Darwin, which makes me love my Mac and not hate it. It gives you all of the benefits of NixOS on macOS, and I haven't found a tool that is as comprehensive as Nix Darwin. Additionally, Home Manager is essentially a .files manager running by Nix, and it is cross-platform as well. So you can use Home Manager with macOS and any Linux distribution and NixOS. So lots of flexibility. So I don't have very much time, but there are some cool implications for Nix in a security context. Because Nix has the largest package repository, I've never needed to use a Kali Linux machine to do security things. I just use Nix. And some examples, a great example I feel like is Metasploit. Metasploit is really painful to package and install. And Nix, if you just Nix run the package, it'll just set it up for you automatically. And that works on macOS and Linux. There are some other tools. If you want to know all of the tools that are available and kind of just a more complete picture of the state of Nix for pen testing, the link at the very bottom, I would suggest taking a look at it because someone has done the work to overview every single thing. I won't be able to get into all of the examples that I provided, but Blue Team for Nix and NixOS I think is really interesting as well because you have a reproducible, auditable system. And once you write a configuration, it exists and can be reused as often as you like. And so I have some examples on things that I'm doing. For example, I'm getting alerts every single time I SSH into my servers because in my home lab, only I should be SSHing in. And if anyone but me logs in, or even if it is me, I want to get a notification. And you can see this is the final result. And it's kind of small, but this is in Signal. I get a notification if someone logs into my server. You can see here, I have an example. Not Spencer tried to log in, which was me, and failed. And so I got an alert. And this is the source code for the Signal/MTFI integration that I'm using in order to get notifications. So if you want to look more. But yeah, here are some other examples: Graylog, syslog-ng, NetFlow, and then I also have a Kubernetes vulnerability scanning service that automatically runs in my Kubernetes cluster, and I use Nix to template it all, which has been very nice. And this is what the final result looks like for vulnerability scans in the project discovery dashboard. And lastly, this presentation is a Nix flake. So perfect example of something that isn't a package that you might want to bundle up for other people to use. These are commands you can use to render my presentation and open it in your browser. Ultimately, I think Nix is awesome, and there aren't many other tools that are like it. And yeah, I won't open up for questions because of time, but if you want to talk to me about Nix or NixOS, I'm Heywood LH on Discord, as well as if you go to heywoodlh.io or github.com/HeywoodLH. There are lots of different ways to contact me. And yeah, that is my presentation. Thank you for attending.